our initial set of interviews on Hardly Working, we're attempting to build up a very specific argument. Chiefly, we want to propose that vocation, career, and work doesn't just magically appear in our lives. Rather, our careers and professional lives are part of a continuum of learning and development that builds slowly over time and is built upon interests that are fundamental to our personalities, characters, and backgrounds. So far, we've had conversations relating to neuroscience and the need for greater balance between technical and implicit skills as a prerequisite for success in the modern economy. We've looked at early childhood as a foundation for the development of implicit skills, which form the foundation of all learning and social development. But there's one step that precedes the formation and function of the brain and the emergence of new people in the form of babies. Any guesses about what it is? If you said marriage and family, you're right. It has often been noted that the family is the first educator, the seedbed of virtue. It's also the seedbed of skill development. Schools and civic institutions can have a huge impact, but they pale in comparison to the influence of parents, siblings, and extended family networks. It is in these intimate relationships that we are formed physically, intellectually, and socially into the adults we ultimately become. Many have pointed to the structural changes in the economy away from manufacturing and toward information and services that have created barriers to fruitful employment and careers. But there's another angle we need to examine to get a fuller picture: the way that changes in family structure have affected life outcomes for children, including their economic outcomes. The social science in this regard is conclusive. Children who grow up with the benefit of two parents who are committed to them and to one another do better on a range of social and economic outcomes. They do better in school, graduate from high school and college at higher rates, have lower rates of criminal justice involvement, are more frequently employed, and earn higher salaries. No family is perfect, and a perfect family isn't the goal. But growing up in a functioning, intact home remains one of the biggest advantages we can give our kids. The trouble is that for decades, American society has been experiencing high levels of divorce and unmarried births. Too many of our relationships are failing, and too many of our children lack the critical formation and support they receive from family. Given those problems, it's no surprise that many children and adults don't do as well as they should in school and work. In recognition of these challenges, the federal government began funding programs in 2005 that support healthy marriage and relationship education for low-income couples. These programs provide voluntary, healthy marriage and relationship education through local community-based organizations. These programs work to help families form and stay together. To look at the results of those programs, I'm joined today by Dr. Alan Hawkins, the Camilla E. Kimball Endowed Professor of Family Life at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Dr. Hawkins is also the author of a recent AEI report looking at the history, implementation, and evaluation of healthy marriage and relationship programs for AEI. We're also joined by Dr. Brad Wilcox, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia and a visiting scholar here at AEI, who is also a leading authority on research into marriage and family. Brad, Alan, thank you for joining me today on Hardly Working.
Thanks, Brad.
Good to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. And we've had a busy day here on the marriage front at AEI. Just wrapped up a session with some of our leading researchers and practitioners in the domain of healthy marriage. And we want to go just a little bit deeper than we went in that event over the next half hour or so. So for those who may not be steeped in the history and philosophy of the federal Healthy Marriage Responsible Fatherhood program, I wanted to ask you first, Brad, to kind of walk us through, from a research standpoint, to talk about why marriage is a public policy issue, because I don't know that everybody agrees that it is or should be.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of disagreement about kind of the importance of family structure when it comes to child well-being, in the last really 50 years, in the wake of a pretty dramatic set of changes around divorce, non-marital childbearing, and single parenthood, all of which really spiked in the late 60s and 70s and 80s. When that change was happening initially, a lot of scholars kind of made the argument that kids are pretty resilient. There can be a stressful period of time when they're reacting to a divorce, for instance, but give them a few years and they'll kind of rebound. But as more and more research was done in this space, we came to find that, a substantial minority of kids had long-term consequences following from, their parents' inability to kind of keep their family lives together. And the work done by Sarah McClanahan at Princeton, for instance, was emblematic of this. I mean, she was someone who herself was divorced and remarried, studying single parents and their kids for many, many years. And after doing just a ton of research on this question, really came to the conclusion that, on average, kids are more likely to flourish in intact married families. And this was kind of in the early 90s that she was coming out with this line of research, and it was picked up in the press with the Dan Quayle Was Right story in The Atlantic by Barbara Defoe Whitehead. And so I think at that moment in time, in the 1990s, more and more sort of center-left scholars like Sarah McClanahan and Bell Sahla Brookings kind of came around to the importance of marriage. So that kind of, I think, gave some additional impetus and legitimacy for later public policy efforts like the one that Wade Horn, really spearheaded that we're talking about today, the Healthy Marriage Initiative, to try to figure out ways that public policy might be, marshaled to strengthen and stabilize family life, in part with an eye towards the role of strengthening marriage.
Can I ask you a question about this? Because it's something that I've puzzled over. You start talking about marriage and you inevitably move almost immediately, as you did, to children. If I'm hearing you correctly, we're really principally interested in marriage from the standpoint of what happens to kids, or is there something else?
I do think there's something else, Brent. I think it's appropriate to keep a strong focus on the kids. There's no question there. But I think we can also, even if we were to factor that out, we see incredible changes in society because of the thinning of the institution of marriage, particularly around men's lack of involvement in that institution and the critical function of parenting. And that does things to adults as well that we are struggling with as a society. I don't know that we can draw, really strong direct lines between that and some of the social problems and the economic problems that we're facing, but there's at least indirect lines there. So I do think it is wider than just the kids.
Yeah, just the kids, just the future. It's also about the present.
Yeah.
What's going on in relationships, a sense of social isolation that is associated with.
Those are incredible public health issues. We know that how well connected people are in their human relationships is incredibly important to health in our adult years. And the most important of those relationships really is the most intimate and most long-lasting one.
Yeah, I just think it's really important to, we're always bearing in mind that marriage is a good. But it's a good for both generations, right? It's a good for adults and it's a good for kids. And that also points to this, the original question about why is this a public policy issue? A happier, healthier society is key to a whole range of other outcomes that we want to see. So moving on from that, not everybody agrees with Brad's analysis, with your analysis. And I'd be interested in hearing from both of you actually about what you think or where you think the opposition to healthy marriage, responsible fatherhood, well, chiefly healthy marriage and relationship education comes from.
I think one part of the story here is that obviously family structures become much more diverse since the 1970s. And so there are plenty of scholars on the left who would like to basically kind of recognize, acknowledge, and lift up that family diversity kind of almost as a value in and of itself. I think there's also a desire not to kind of blame the victim, to kind of blame, people who for a range of different circumstances end up as single parents or as non-residential parents. I think that's part of the story as well, in terms of motivating people's kind of concern about these issues and being concerned about using the M word. There's also kind of a parallel perspective on the left that what really matters is not family structure per se, but family process. So love makes a family, not a marriage certificate is kind of, I think, the idea here. And it's certainly true that if you actually look at the dynamics in any given family, whatever its structure, when there is more affection, there's, more consistent discipline, there's more attention, for kids, these proximate processes are the most important predictors of kids' outcomes and of family outcomes more generally. And so they're right about the importance of family process. But what they don't necessarily publicly acknowledge is that those processes tend to be better, not always, of course, but tend to be better in intact married families. We've got two parents who are committed to one another and often have a biological connection to the kids, which motivates them, equips them, enables them to be more affectionate, more attentive, and better disciplinarians.
Yeah, and I would argue, Brad, that it's not just a probability, but that there are processes involved in long-term committed relationships and in marriage that facilitate those better processes. So it's not just a matter of chance. That there's a pretty strong causal link between structure and process. When critics have been attacking this Healthy Marriage and Relationship Education Initiative and the Responsible Fatherhood Initiative, they often want to paint a picture that all of these things are derivative of economics, of economic well-being in our society. And if we were able to fix that part, that these other things would all be solved. And I am one who certainly thinks I sure hope that they can find the right levers to pull to make a better, stronger, fairer economic society for all. I think there's no question that that's going to help, but it's not going to move us all the way or even nearly as much of the way as we need.
And from my standpoint, I think they've got it the wrong way around. I mean, it's not that the economic conditions don't matter and, not having access to employment doesn't make marriage more difficult. I think that's true. But I also think that if you conceive of society as being formed from the ground up rather than, manipulated from the top down, it really calls our attention to what's going on inside our families that gets reflected in some of the negative economic outcomes that we're seeing. I see this in the workforce development sphere all the time, which is you talk to employers about what's missing in the workforce. They don't actually reach for technical skills as their main concern. What they reach for is soft skills, non-cognitive skills, implicit skills, relationship skills. Well, where do those things come from? And we know from the research and the science that the capacity for that is actually built extremely early in the life of a human being. And the more stress that you put on those early years, the harder time kids have, I think, in developing that matrix of social and emotional relationship skills that then permits them to function well in the workforce. It forms the capacity for learning, and then it forms the capacity for working in teams and communicating and all the things that we need in the workforce. So what I would say is it's true there are barriers in the economy that we need to deal with. It's also true that people are coming to those barriers disadvantaged, and we need to look at that as well. Let's use that to shift a little bit and just, Alan, I'd really like you to walk us through this report you've done for us, and we'll include this in the show notes for this podcast. We commissioned you to do a study for us, or report actually for us on sort of summarizing what we know about the federal investment in healthy marriage and relationship education. So I'd just like you to walk through kind of what are the highlights of that report.
Well, about 15 years ago, the federal government, under the direction of then Assistant Secretary Wade Horn, decided that they wanted to take a shot at this. Can we do some kinds of programming that are going to help couples form and sustain healthy relationships and enduring marriages? There were a lot of different directions they could have gone, but they developed a primary funding stream to support community-based organizations in reaching out to these mostly disadvantaged couples and to help them strengthen their relationship with relationship education programming and services. And I think the evidence is there was certainly a concern. Well, are people even going to be interested in these kinds of things? And I think the research has been pretty strong there. There is a keen interest there. Although it's a fairly small pot of money by federal standards, we seem to be reaching 180 to 190,000 people a year in these programs. youth, young adults, married, unmarried, step families, a wide range. Also, most of them are clearly poor or near poor, a great deal of racial and ethnic diversity. Even some of the current programs report serving same-sex couples. And so it's reaching a very diverse group at significant numbers at a pretty modest cost in terms of government programming. We certainly have made progress at that level.
So we placed a bet, a public policy bet. We could improve the likelihood of families forming and helping them to remain together by investing in these community-based organizations that are doing relationship education at the ground level, really working in local neighborhoods and communities. So how would you characterize the results coming out of this?
I think, first thing I would say is that it's been very impressive. A very serious and extensive agenda of evaluation was put in place from the very beginning of this. And that's unusual. You usually wait a decade or two, get your feet wet, learn how to do this, and then you go through the evaluation process. But this came at the same time that the federal government was starting to stress more and more evidence-based programming and policy, knowing that there would be some controversy and some criticism of this initiative. The Administration for Children and Families put significant energy and resources behind an evaluation component to what was going on, including several gold standard, rigorous experimental studies evaluating the impact of these programs.
I really like the way Wade talked about this, Wade Horn, who was the progenitor of all of this, that the better your program design, the better your evaluation design, the more likely you are to get zero results.
Which is what we saw coming right out of the chute. The first large gold standard study, evaluation study that was done, did not find general impacts. There's some minor things, and one of the sites had some positive, but overall, it was not encouraging. It was the no impact. And many of the critics kind of attached to that first study and said, we're wasting our time. Science has proven this won't work. Well, that's not the way science works. It's slower, it's iterative, and you learn and you grow, and especially in the policy field. As subsequent studies came out, they began to find more positive impact. Not big impacts, small to medium impacts on the quality of couple relationships. Some studies showing some impact on less divorce. So creating greater family stability by keeping families together, married and unmarried. And even studies showing less violence in these relationships. And I think also noteworthy is also seeing some impact on children's behavior and on better parenting and co-parenting going on. They haven't been dramatic, but in the most rigorous work that we've done, we're beginning to see some impact, especially for those who are more disadvantaged as they come to these programs. Probably that means they're really more motivated. They really want this relationship to work. It's not working has much bigger, stronger, and negative effects on them than it does, the average well-educated college graduate.
It's an interesting point that we need to draw out a little bit, I think, here, which is that while they may be more motivated, one of the things we've also found is they're much higher need, and that those two things may be related.
Yeah.
So
I think there are some more positive. Now, it's not just that there are, I've counted more than 50 studies that have been done on these programs with various methods. And you kind of put that all together, and it shows some disappointing findings, yes, some encouraging findings, especially so early on in this policy initiative and its history. And some more nuanced findings about who benefits the most and maybe how we can start to improve what we do. And I think we're on the verge of another wave of studies coming out in the next year that are going to also be very instructive in helping us learn how to do this work to help couples form and sustain these healthy relationships and these strong marriages.
after listening to you this morning and again this afternoon, I mean, one of the things that it occurs to me is that in a sense, the way that the Federal Healthy Marriage and Relationship Education Program was developed and rolled out may actually be a model for what we want to do on a wide range of social policy interventions because of the rigor, both of the design of the programs, but also this early evaluation. If we put all that in the context of that you have to wait for a while to see what's happening in these programs, my experience looking at a bunch of other domains is that it is the norm not just to not get those results up front, but to ever get results. What we often see is with a lot of our big social policy interventions is that year after year, decade after decade, they don't produce positive impacts. And that's my impression. I don't know if, Brad, if you share that, if you've seen that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was one of the points that was interesting that Wade Horn brought up, was just that the work of Peter Rossi and others suggests that, kind of the net effect of a lot of social policy is about zero, and that, we don't find that many policies actually really move the needle very much in people's lives, unfortunately. So, it's encouraging. There are some signs that some programs are working, as your report indicates, Alan, and we've also seen too, in the private arena with this effort in Jacksonville, for instance, from the Cultural Freedom Initiative, that they looked, pretty robust in terms of their ability to bring divorce down. And Jacksonville, there was an initiative that came out of the Philanthropy Roundtable that was designed to work with churches and nonprofits. They had a digital dimension to the campaign where they were sending out, I think, videos and advertisements. They had public events that were designed to bring couples out for, date nights and things like that. And across all these different events, they had kind of a marriage-friendly theme being articulated. And rolling that out in 2016 and tracking divorce rates, since then, divorce came down more than 20% basically in the course of, 2 to 3 years there in Jacksonville. So it suggests that, in this case, a private initiative that's working across a number of different fronts, both, in the culture, online, in churches and nonprofits, can have some success in moving the needle in terms of stabilizing marriage. So that's also kind of one more thing to think about. Are there private models that we can encourage philanthropists to get behind that will also do important work in this space? And often they have more flexibility, both in terms of just, their bureaucratic flexibility, but also in terms of kind of articulating the values and virtues that are required to sustain strong marriages, because they're not directly tied to the federal government. So that's one more, I think, tool to sort of think about using in terms of this agenda.
And I agree. I think the church has a really important role to play in this. And actually, if we ask these participants who come to these kinds of relationship strengthening programs, where would you most like to get this from? Most of the times they'll say, we'd like it to be religiously based. We'd like to get it from our faith-based communities. There's a kind of synergy and a strength that is really important, and not something that I think a federal government-supported initiative can help with very much. I mean, yeah, maybe around the edges, but so I think there's a really important role for the private sector, and particularly the faith sector, to make these kinds of programs and services available in their communities, and not just to their congregants, but to many who would prefer to receive these services in a faith-based environment. And I think that includes, lower income couples who often are not seen as often in the pews, but in many ways are more religious and more spiritual, and really trust that institution. So I do think there's an important role there for the church to play.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, religions, generally speaking, are in the marriage business. That's one of their main functions. And we can't spend public dollars on explicitly religious activities. Those institutions can be feeder mechanisms and places for delivery of services, even if they aren't strictly religious or explicitly religious in their content. So yes, those partnerships are really critical. So Alan, I wanted to ask you about some of your thoughts on thinking about marriage as a public health issue, because I thought that was really interesting.
the federal funding for this work has focused primarily on pretty intensive educational programming and services for couples. And it's a tough challenge, and it's a heavy lift for some program to help couples achieve their desires for these healthy and stable and strong marriages. I think there's an important service that's provided there, but let's not forget that that doesn't reach a significant proportion of our population. And we all struggle with the formation and maintenance of our relationships, these incredibly intimate relationships in which we invest so much hope. And we kind of almost put them up on a pedestal. This is hard to do. I think there's more that we can be doing. You might want to call it more of a micro intervention, but more of a public health approach to preventing these problems, helping youth and young adults to understand what a healthy relationship is, avoid the common pitfalls that make it harder to achieve those relationships, and what are the basic fundamental human skills that make these relationships workable. A number of things that can be done on a much broader scale, much more sort of micro-targeted, if you will, rather than insisting you have 12 to 24 hours of programming over 3 to 6 months to help strengthen your relationship. That's a big, big ask. And very motivated individuals will do so, and I do think they can derive some benefit. But we need to be thinking bigger than that. And we need to be thinking cultural change. We're cultural creatures, and if we could find some of those levers to nudge the culture one way or the other, maybe we can prevent more of these situations that make it hard.
And maybe we nudge the culture by nudging the individuals. Last year, I signed up for a dieting app, and this dieting app, I have a person who is responsible for tracking whether I'm keeping track of what I'm eating, right? So if I miss a meal or two, if I don't enter it into my phone, I get a text from Marissa who says, I noticed you've missed a couple meals. Don't forget, this is really important. And that kind of use of social media to nudge people toward healthier behaviors is pretty effective. At least it's been effective for me in this domain. And I really think that it could be effective.
And part of that nudging, and Brad could speak to this, is also getting rid of the barriers that are those anti-nudges.
Yeah.
And I think there still are some of those policy barriers out there.
Yeah.
Particularly, I think, for the poorer working class in our society.
Yeah, Brad, did you want to?
We've got a report coming out soon, basically, that suggests that for working class Americans, there's often barriers around things like Medicaid and child care, subsidies from the federal and state governments. I was talking to a couple in Virginia a couple months ago, and they're together. They've got 2 beautiful little daughters, but they weren't married. I'm like, well, what's going on here? And they said, well, they actually had sat down at the kitchen table and they calculated out what would happen to the mom's Medicaid and then the kids' Medicaid were they to marry and kind of present their joint income, and they would lose access to health care insurance because his company did not pay health insurance for his family. So that's a concrete example of the way in which I think one of the barriers here to marriage and flexibility is around.
I've always been just a little bit skeptical of that, but I think that healthcare example is a really good one because there's so much anxiety around access to insurance. If you start messing with people's insurance, that's a really powerful push to say, we need to think about this because we don't have any other healthcare coverage. And so I hadn't considered the Medicaid side of this. I think it's really important.
But I think, too, the reality that Wade Horn was talking about today in our session was that the pop culture is not really aligned with marriage, right? So you've got a lot of people out there who aren't very well formed in terms of their normative appreciation of marriage. And then, they have some apprehension, some understanding that, they could lose access to food stamps or healthcare or childcare subsidies. And, that understanding and that awareness in their networks can tip, the scale towards non-marriage. So it's not the only thing by any stretch, but, I think it does sort of, unfortunately reinforce the sort of family instability pattern that we've seen emerge among working class Americans since the 1980s.
Very interesting. I'm going to let you go here shortly, but I've got an exit question for you both, which is, based on what we have learned over the last, since 2005, when these programs really started to take off, at least from the federal level, and what we've learned since the introduction of the Healthy Marriage and Relationship Education program, where, if you had the authority to say, here's what we need to do next, what would that be?
Well, I think one thing that we need to do more is to think about, prevention here. And so I think trying to encourage our schools, our public schools, and private schools for that matter, including religious schools, and of course the pop culture creators, to not paint a fairy tale, not rose-colored lenses thing about family life, but just actually the reality. The reality is often difficult and hard for, I think, most families at different points in their lives. But just to say, look, folks, if you can manage to, get your education, get a job, get married before having kids, and then keep together through thick and thin, the odds that your kids are going to flourish, the odds that you're going to flourish socially and financially are just much, much higher. And if people have that broader awareness about kind of the way in which this success sequence is a path towards, relative prosperity, towards the American dream, that would be a real service to the public. The government has some role to play in that potentially, but then also obviously a range of private, both corporate and civic actors also would be, I think, needed for this effort as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah.
There's also, I think, a number of things that we can be doing that will improve on what we've started with, this more intensive relationship strengthening programming that we've got. We're still pretty early on in our learning curve there. And, first of all, there are some that are farther up on that curve and have really shown that they know what they're doing. They can bring the people in and they can show positive effects. We need to, I think, be supportive of that and help those groups help the others learn. I also think, though, we need to be more innovative in this field. How do we help those who have a motivation for forming and sustaining these healthy relationships? How are we going to help them? I think one other thing we can do is get some funding behind some creative ideas, things that outside the box kinds of ideas that we ought to be testing a little bit. Because, 12 to 24 hours of educational programming is a really big ask.
Yeah, to leave your house and go somewhere and do something for 24 hours over a 2-month period is a huge...
It is. And
especially if you got little kids.
So let's try some other kinds of things. The analogy that I have is I'm old enough that I remember the old DOS language that you had to use to make a personal computer work. You had to know the language to tell it what to do. You had to type it in. That's ridiculous. We live in the age of click and drag kind of thing, and we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. But I wonder if we can help individuals learn that there are some basic fundamental things that we can do, that we can all do, regardless of our circumstances in life, that make an important difference. We don't have to fix every little piece of the system, but if we can fix that one thing, there's some other things that come along with that. That gives you more hope about the relationship and its potential and its future. And I just think there's got to be some more of that out there that will be more efficient.
Yeah, I really love that point. And I think it's a good one to go out on, because ultimately what's going to support marriage in this country are the decisions of millions and millions of individuals. And having that information, like the impact on your marriage of speaking with kindness and respect to one another, the incredibly important role that plays in sustaining a marriage, that's a very simple thing. And you don't have to be, go to 14 hours of training in order to understand that that's an important thing. So I just think that that's really a good insight.
And if we can get those really powerful messages out a little bit at a time, over time, we may be able to accomplish more efficiently what a 24-hour educational program does for the few who are motivated enough and disciplined enough to take advantage of that.
Well, Brad, Alan, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a very fruitful, helpful discussion, and I look forward to more conversations like this.
Thanks, Brent.
Thank you.